Welcome to Passions Illustrated. Before starting the video, make sure to like, share, and subscribe.
The sound of high heels against the marble floor echoed through the elegant law office of Morrison & Associates in Chicago. Lauren Bennett adjusted her Chanel blazer as she walked determinedly towards the meeting room. Her heart was racing, not from anxiety about the important meeting that was about to take place, but from the presence of Richard Morrison, her fiancé of 2 years, and as far as anyone knew, the sole heir to the Morrison empire. "Miss Bennett, they're already waiting," announced the secretary, opening the tempered glass door that gave access to the meeting room. Lauren entered the room and her eyes immediately met Richard's. He was sitting at a mahogany table. He was sitting at the mahogany table looking impeccable in his navy suit, his brown hair perfectly straight, and that smile that always melted her. But today was different. Today, she had other priorities. Lauren, I'm so glad you're here," said Maxwell Peterson, the firm's head lawyer, standing up to greet her. "We have important news about the Morrison case." Richard frowned clearly, confused by his fiancée's presence at a meeting that was supposed to be strictly family. Lauren avoided his gaze, concentrating on the documents that Maxwell was beginning to distribute. "We have received information that could significantly alter the succession of the Morrison family." Maxwell began, his deep voice filling the room. "There is a possibility that there will be another heir." The silence that followed was deafening. Richard straightened up in his chair, his green eyes fixed on the lawyer. Lauren felt her stomach turn. She had known this information for weeks thanks to a private investigation she had secretly conducted. "What do you mean, another heir?" Richard asked, his voice controlled, but Lauren could see the tension in his shoulders. "Alexander Morrison, your second cousin, apparently has documents proving that he is the true majority heir," Maxwell explained, spreading out photographs and certificates on the table. "According to this evidence, the original will was irregularly altered." Lauren watched the scene unfold, her heart torn between guilt and ambition. She had met Alexander 3 months earlier at a charity event in New York. Tall, sophisticated, and with a net worth potentially greater than Richard's, Alexander had become her secret obsession. "That's impossible," Richard protested, running his hands through his hair in frustration. "My father always made it clear that I was the only heir." "The evidence is quite convincing," Maxwell continued, his professional voice masking the discomfort of the situation. "We'll need time to investigate properly." It was at that moment that Charlotte Madison, the social worker who had been hired to help with the genealogical investigation, entered the room. Her red hair was tied up in a discreet bun, and her blue eyes conveyed a calm that contrasted with the tension in the room. "Sorry, I'm late," she said softly, taking a seat next to Richard. "I've brought some additional information about the family records." Lauren felt a pang of jealousy as she noticed how Richard seemed to relax slightly at Charlotte's arrival. There was something about the way they interacted that bothered her deeply. "Charlotte has been instrumental in this investigation," Maxwell explained. "She's uncovered important records in the Boston archives that could help shed light on this situation." The meeting went on for another 2 hours with heated discussions about documents, dates, and family lineages. Lauren remained quiet, watching as Richard handled the situation with a dignity she hadn't expected. This only made his own actions even harder to justify. At the end of the meeting, as everyone began to leave, Richard gently took Lauren's arm. "Can we talk in private?" Lauren nodded, feeling the weight of her choices more than ever. They made their way to Richard's private office, where the silence between them seemed suffocating. "You knew about this, didn't you?" Richard asked, his voice more hurt than accusatory. Lauren hesitated for a moment before replying, "Yes, I knew. Alexander came to me a few weeks ago." "And you didn't tell me?" He noted the disappointment evident on his face. "Why?" "Richard Thurene," she began, but the words seemed inadequate. How could she explain that she had allowed herself to be seduced by the idea of an even greater fortune? How could she justify betraying the man who had always treated her with such love and respect? "You don't have to explain," he said, turning to the window that offered a panoramic view of Chicago. "Your actions say more than any words could." Lauren felt tears forming in her eyes but held them back. She had made her choice, and now she had to live with the consequences. As she left Richard's office, she saw Charlotte talking to him in the hallway, offering words of comfort and support that should have come from her. The day had only just begun, and Lauren Bennett already knew that she had made the biggest mistake of her life. What she didn't know was that her actions had triggered a series of events that would forever change not only her life, but that of everyone involved in this complex web of love, ambition, and redemption. Alexander. Morrison was examining the documents in his luxury penthouse in Manhattan, a satisfied smile playing on his lips as he sipped a single malt whiskey. The plan was working perfectly. Lauren had taken the bait, and now it was only a matter of time before the Morrison fortune was in her hands. Or so he thought. On the other side of town, Charlotte Madison was poring over a pile of old records at the New York Public Archives. Her instincts as a social worker told her that something didn't fit with Alexander's story. After years of helping people find their origins, she had developed a sixth sense for forged documents. Ms. Madison. A familiar voice made her look up. Richard Morrison was standing there looking exhausted after his flight from Chicago. "Richard, I didn't expect to see you here," Charlotte replied, straightening her reading glasses. "I thought you'd be dealing with the lawyers in Chicago." "I needed to see these documents for myself," he said, pulling up a chair. "And frankly, I needed to get away from it all for a moment." Charlotte noticed the dark circles under his eyes and the way his shoulders were tense. Lauren's betrayal had been a hard blow, but there was something else there, a determination she admired. "I found some interesting inconsistencies," Charlotte commented, handing him a few pages. "The birth records Alexander presented have watermarks that only came into use in 1975, but the document is supposedly from 1968. Richard leaned over to examine the papers, his arm brushing Charlotte's lightly. She tried to ignore the shiver that ran down her spine at the contact. Meanwhile, in Chicago, Lauren was having dinner with Alexander at the exclusive Alinea restaurant. He was everything she had ever wanted. Sophisticated, powerful, and, apparently, destined for a fortune even greater than the Morrisons. "Darling, you made the right choice," Alexander said, covering her hand with his. "Richard could never give you the life you deserve." Lauren smiled, but something in her stomach squirmed. The words sounded empty, unlike the sincerity she always found in Richard's eyes. Back in New York, Charlotte and Richard had moved into a nearby coffee shop surrounded by papers and laptops. The familiarity between them grew naturally, fueled by evenings of working together and honest conversations. "You know what's strange?" Charlotte asked, taking a sip of her coffee. "I can't find any record of Alexander before 2010. It's like he came out of nowhere." Richard frowned, typing rapidly on his laptop. "Maybe because that's not his real name." Charlotte leaned over to look at the screen, her soft vanilla perfume enveloping Richard. On the screen, an old police report showed a photo that made them both hold their breath. Alexander, under another name, involved in a fraud scheme in Boston. "James Cooper," Richard read aloud, "wanted for document forgery and embezzlement in 3 states. Richard." Charlotte whispered, her hand finding his instinctively. "That changes everything." Just then, Richard's cell phone vibrated with a message from an unknown number. "I found your birth parents. We need to talk. Marcus Reynolds, private investigator." Richard's heart raced. He had secretly hired Marcus weeks ago looking for answers about his own adoption, a secret he kept even from Lauren. "I have to go," he told Charlotte, standing up abruptly. "But we need to continue this tomorrow." Charlotte nodded, trying to ignore the emptiness she felt when he let go of her hand. "I'll be here." Richard took a cab to Marcus's office in the Bronx, his mind a storm of possibilities. As he entered the investigator's modest office, he wasn't prepared for what he would find. "Your parents are the Reynolds," Marcus said bluntly, pushing a folder across the desk. "Catherine and William Reynolds of Reynolds Technologies." Richard sat down heavily. Reynolds Technologies was one of the largest technology companies in the country, with a market value that made the Morrison fortune look modest in comparison. They looked for you for years, Marcus continued, but the adoption agency closed and the records were lost. They never gave up. While Richard was processing the information in Chicago, Lauren received a call that chilled her blood. It was her FBI contact Alexander Morrison, or rather James Cooper, was being investigated for a series of elaborate frauds. The realization hit her like a speeding train. She had abandoned a good and true man for a criminal. And now, unbeknownst to her, that same man was about to discover that he was the heir to a fortune that would make the dispute over the Morrison estate look like a child's tussle. Fate apparently had a peculiar sense of humor, and Lauren Bennett was about to discover the true price of her ambition. The Reynolds Manhattan office shone against the night sky like a beacon of possibility. Richard adjusted his tie as the elevator rose to the top floor of Reynolds Technologies. Charlotte was by his side, her reassuring presence more necessary than ever. "You didn't have to come," Richard said softly, although his expression showed otherwise. "I know," Charlotte replied, a small smile on her lips. "But I wanted to be here." The elevator doors opened to reveal Catherine Reynolds, an elegant woman in her 60s with perfectly styled gray hair and eyes the same green eyes as Richard's, brimming with tears. "Richard," she whispered, her hands trembling slightly. "After so long." William Reynolds appeared right behind, tall and imposing like Richard, but with an expression softened by the emotion of the moment. The silence that followed was filled with 30 years of absence, unasked questions, and unspoken words. Meanwhile, in Chicago, Lauren was receiving an urgent call from the FBI. "Miss Bennett, we need your cooperation. Alexander Morrison, or rather James Cooper, is about to transfer a significant amount of money from the Morrisons to offshore accounts." Lauren felt her blood run cold in her veins. Her ambition had led her not only to betray Richard, but also to become an unwitting accomplice to a massive fraud. Back in Manhattan, the Reynolds shared their story with Richard and Charlotte. Catherine held up an old baby photo as she spoke. "It was a car accident," she explained, her voice breaking. "We were unconscious for weeks. When we woke up, we were told that you hadn't survived. Years later, we found out that the nurse had falsified the documents and given you up for adoption." "The Morrisons," Richard added, beginning to understand. "They didn't know." "No," William replied, running a hand through his gray hair. "They adopted you legally through the agency. The nurse, she forged our signatures on the relinquishment papers." Charlotte watched the interaction with attentive eyes, noticing the similarities between Richard and his biological parents, not just physically, but in gestures and the way they spoke. It was like watching the pieces of a puzzle fit together perfectly. In Chicago, Lauren was facing her own moral dilemma. Alexander had just proposed to her an ostentatious diamond ring, sparkling under the lights of the Everest restaurant. "Think of it as a new beginning," he said, his calculating eyes disguised by a charming smile. "We both deserve the best." Lauren looked at the ring, remembering the moment when Richard had proposed to her. No ostentation, just sincere love at a picnic in Millennium Park. The difference was stark. In the Reynolds penthouse, Richard was discovering more about his past and his future. Reynolds Technologies wasn't just a technology company, it was a powerhouse in sustainable innovation with projects that could change the world. "We want you to take your place in the company," William said, "not out of obligation, but because you have a right to know your legacy." Charlotte noticed how Richard processed the information not with greed or triumph, but with a sense of responsibility that she had learned to admire. "There's something you need to know," Richard began, telling her about Alexander James and his attempt to defraud the Morrisons. Catherine and William exchanged worried glances. "We know James Cooper," William revealed. "He tried the same scam with other families. He's a well-known scammer on the business circuit." Just then, Richard's cell phone rang. It was Lauren. Her hands were shaking as she confessed everything: Alexander's plan, her unwitting participation, the marriage proposal. "Richard, I know I don't deserve it, but I have to do the right thing," she said, her voice broken by regret. I have evidence against him." Charlotte watched Richard's expression soften, not out of love for Lauren, she realized, but out of compassion. He had changed over the last few weeks, grown through the pain, and discovered an inner strength that few possessed. "Pass the information on to the FBI," he replied calmly. "It's the right thing to do." After hanging up, Richard met Charlotte's eyes. No words were needed. The understanding between them went beyond the verbal. She had been by his side throughout this journey, not out of interest or obligation, but out of a genuine connection that grew every day. Catherine watched the exchange of glances between her newly found son and the social worker, a knowing smile on her lips. Sometimes she thought we lose something, only to find something even better. In Chicago, Lauren was handing over a folder of documents to the FBI agents while Alexander was detained in his penthouse, his empire of lies crumbling like a house of cards. The sun was just beginning to rise over Manhattan when Richard and Charlotte left the Reynolds apartment. In the elevator, their hands met naturally as if they had done this 1,000 times before. "What are you going to do now?" Charlotte asked, her blue eyes reflecting the soft morning light. Richard smiled gently, squeezing her hand. "Start again, with the truth this time." And as the elevator descended, taking them back to the world outside, they both knew that this was not an ending, but a beginning of a story worth far more than any fortune. The news of the arrest of Alexander Morrison, or rather James Cooper, exploded like a bomb in the social circles of Chicago and New York. Lauren watched the television coverage from her apartment, an untouched glass of wine by her side, as the headlines highlighted the details of the elaborate fraud she had unwittingly helped to perpetuate. "Millionaire fraud suspect arrested in Chicago, fake heir tried to usurp Morrison family fortune," announced the local news anchor. Her phone kept ringing, friends, acquaintances, and journalists wanting her side of the story. She had become part of the scandal, the bride who abandoned the Morrison heir for the imposter. The irony of the situation did not escape her. Meanwhile, at the Reynolds Technologies headquarters in Manhattan, Richard was facing a series of meetings with the board of directors. Charlotte accompanied him as a consultant, her presence providing a safe haven in the midst of the corporate turmoil. "The transition needs to be gradual," William Reynolds explained during a closed meeting. "We want to announce his return to the family and his position in the company in the right way." Catherine Reynolds added, her eyes shining with maternal pride. "We've already lost 30 years. We don't want to rush things now." Richard adjusted his tie, a gesture that Charlotte had already learned to recognize as a sign of nervousness. "We still have the Morrison situation to sort out. They raised me, they gave me everything. I can't just turn my back on that." Charlotte admired this loyalty in him. Even after discovering his true identity and heritage, Richard remained faithful to the values the Morrisons had taught him. "The Morrisons are on their way to New York," Charlotte informed him, consulting her tablet. "They want to talk in person." The news made Richard tense his shoulders. Margaret and James Morrison had been his parents for 30 years. How could he explain that despite the discovery of his biological parents, the love and gratitude he felt for them remained unchanged? In Chicago, Lauren finally summoned up the courage to do something she should have done weeks ago. She went to the Morrison mansion, where Margaret Morrison greeted her with an expression that mixed disappointment and pity. "Mrs. Morrison, Lauren began, but her words failed her. "Spare us, dear." Margaret interrupted, her voice surprisingly gentle. "You've made your choices. Now you have to live with them." "I came to ask for forgiveness," Lauren managed to say, tears streaming down her perfectly made-up face. "Not for what I did to myself, but for what I did to Richard." Margaret studied the young woman for a moment. "You know, Lauren, sometimes we lose something only for the universe to show us that it was never really ours." Back in New York, Richard and Charlotte had escaped the corporate environment for a quiet moment in Highline Park. The late afternoon sun painted the sky in shades of pink and orange, creating an almost magical atmosphere. "How are you really coping with all this?" Charlotte asked as they walked side by side. Richard stopped leaning on the parapet that offered a spectacular view of the city. Honestly, it still seems surreal. A month ago, I was just Richard. Morrison Lauren's fiancé, heir to a fortune I thought I might lose. Now, you're Richard Reynolds, heir to an even bigger fortune, Charlotte added with a mischievous smile. Richard laughed, the sincere sound echoing in the night air. Actually, I'm just Richard now. No Morrison, no Reynolds. Just discovering who I really am. Charlotte felt her heart race as he turned to face her. There was something different in his gaze and intensity that made her stomach turn. And you've helped me a lot with that, he continued, his hand finding hers on the ledge. The moment was interrupted by Richard's phone. It was James Morrison informing them that they had arrived in New York. The meeting that could change everything was scheduled for the following morning. In the Reynolds penthouse, Catherine was looking at old family photos, including the one of the baby she thought she had lost. William joined her, enveloping her in a hug. "He's amazing, isn't he?" Catherine whispered. "The Morrisons did a wonderful job." "Yes," William agreed. "And that social worker, have you noticed how he looks at her?" Catherine smiled. "The same way you looked at me when we first met." In her hotel room in New York, Lauren reread old text messages exchanged with Richard, each word a painful reminder of everything she had thrown away. Her phone vibrated with a notification. A photo on social media showed Richard and Charlotte in Highline Park, the sunset in the background, their faces illuminated by more than just natural light. Lauren closed the app, a bittersweet feeling overtaking her. Richard had moved on, not just professionally but emotionally too. And for the first time, she realized that perhaps this was exactly how things should be. The next morning promised to be a milestone in the lives of everyone involved. The Morrison and Reynolds families would meet, truths would be shared, and a new chapter would begin. And at the center of it all was Richard, no longer lost between identities, but finally finding his own way, with Charlotte silently by his side, her presence more valuable than any inheritance. The conference room on the top floor of Reynolds Technologies vibrated with an almost palpable tension. On one side of the mahogany table, James and Margaret Morrison, the people who had lovingly raised Richard for 3 decades. On the other, Catherine and William Reynolds, his newly discovered biological parents. At the center of this unique family constellation, Richard was trying to find his place with Charlotte discreetly by his side. "You've given our son something we can never repay." Catherine began, her voice laced with emotion. "A family values unconditional love." Margaret Morrison squeezed her husband's hand under the table. "Richard will always be our son, regardless of DNA or legal documents. That's why we're here," Richard interjected, his voice firm but gentle. "Not to choose between families, but to expand our definition of what it means to be a family." William Reynolds sniffed, unfolding some documents. "We've drawn up a proposal. Reynolds Technologies and Morrison and Associates could benefit from a strategic partnership. Richard could act as a bridge between the companies." Charlotte watched the dynamic with attentive eyes, admiring how Richard navigated this delicate situation with grace and maturity. Her fingers lightly brushed his under the table, a subtle gesture of support that did not go unnoticed by Margaret Morrison. In Chicago, Lauren was facing her own consequences. The FBI had set up a meeting to discuss her unwitting involvement in the Alexander Chiu James scam. Sitting in an austere interrogation room, she realized how her quest for status and wealth had led her down a dangerous path. Miss Bennett, Special Agent Sarah Martinez, began, "Your cooperation was instrumental in dismantling a significant criminal operation. Alexander Cooper, or James Cooper, as you knew him, had an extensive history of similar frauds." Lauren nodded, feeling the weight of her choices more than ever. "I should have seen the signs." Back in New York, lunch between the families had moved to Le Bernardin restaurant. The initial formality was beginning to melt like ice in the spring sunshine. Richard was 5 when he decided he was going to be a superhero, Margaret shared, making Catherine smile through her tears. "He spent a whole week wearing a towel as a cape. I still have the photos," James Morrison added, winking at Richard. Charlotte noticed how Richard gradually relaxed their families, beginning to interweave into a unique and complex tapestry. Under the table, her hand found his again, this time remaining there. "Charlotte has been invaluable throughout this process," Richard commented, his thumb tracing gentle circles in her palm. "I don't know what I would have done without her support." Catherine and Margaret exchanged knowing glances. Both mothers recognized the sparkle in their son's eyes as he looked at the social worker. In the afternoon, while the families discussed legal details with the lawyers, Richard and Charlotte escaped for a walk in Central Park. Autumn painted the trees in shades of red and gold, creating a perfect backdrop for important conversations. "You've done something amazing today," Charlotte commented as they walked near the lake. "Bringing two families together like that isn't easy." Richard stopped, turning to face her. "You helped me see that we don't have to choose. The heart has an infinite capacity for love." The moment was interrupted by Charlotte's phone. It was Lauren asking to speak to Richard. He hesitated only for a second before answering, putting it on speaker. "Richard," Lauren began, her voice trembling slightly. "I've just left the FBI. I wanted you to know that I'm testifying against Alexander. It's the least I can do to try and make amends for my mistakes." "Thank you for telling me," Richard replied, his voice gentle but distant. "I hope you find your way, Lauren." After hanging up, Richard and Charlotte continued their walk, arriving at Bethesda Fountain. The afternoon sun danced on the water, creating golden reflections that seemed to celebrate new beginnings. "You know," Richard said, stopping near the fountain. "With everything that's happened in the last few weeks, I've realized something important." Charlotte looked at him questioningly, her heart racing at the intensity of his gaze. "Sometimes we lose something only to discover that the real treasure was right in front of us all along," he continued, his hands finding hers. The fountain murmured softly behind them, a silent witness to a moment that had begun with genealogical research and was blossoming into something much deeper and truer. And as the sun began to set over Manhattan, two different but united families celebrated not only the rediscovery of a child, but also the birth of something new and precious, a love that had grown naturally without pretension or expectation. Just the pure truth of two hearts meeting at the right moment. The Reynolds Technologies office was buzzing with the news of the official announcement. Richard Reynolds Morrison was to be formally introduced as the company's new vice president of operations. The merging of the surnames had been his personal choice, a way of honoring both families that were part of his history. Charlotte was adjusting Richard's tie in his private office, her deft fingers gliding across the navy blue silk. "Are you nervous?" "Less than I should be," he replied, capturing her hand before she could pull away. "Having you here helps." Over the last 2 months, their relationship had blossomed naturally, as if every moment shared during the investigation had prepared them for something greater. There were no big declarations or dramatic moments, just the quiet certainty that they belonged together. In Chicago, Lauren was preparing for her final testimony in the case against Alexander St. James. The weeks of cooperation with the FBI had been an exercise in humility and self-knowledge. Sitting in her apartment, now stripped of the luxurious items that once seemed so important, she reread a letter she had written to Richard but would never send. The ballroom of the Four Seasons Hotel was elegantly decorated for the official announcement. Catherine and William Reynolds were chatting animatedly with Margaret and James Morrison, the two families now united, not only by legal documents but by a genuine affection that surprised everyone. "I never imagined we'd have 4 grandparents vying for the attention of future grandchildren," Charlotte whispered to Richard, making him choke on his champagne. "Are you already planning our family?" He teased, his eyes sparkling with a mixture of amusement and hope. Before she could reply, William Reynolds took to the stage to begin the ceremony. The speech was a celebration not just of the company's future, but of the extraordinary journey that had brought everyone there. "Today, we don't just celebrate a corporate merger," William began, his strong voice echoing through the hall. "We celebrate how fate, sometimes through tortuous paths, brings us exactly where we should be." Richard watched from the front row, Charlotte by his side, their hands discreetly intertwined under the table. Catherine and Margaret exchanged complicit smiles. Both had noticed the small volume in Charlotte's briefcase where a lease for an apartment in Greenwich Village awaited her and Richard's signatures. In Chicago, the federal courthouse was packed for Alexander Cooper's sentencing. Lauren testified with dignity, her voice firm as she detailed how she had been manipulated, but also taking responsibility for her own choices. Miss Bennett, the judge declared, showed considerable courage in coming forward and assisting in the investigation. Her cooperation was instrumental in dismantling a significant criminal operation. After the sentence, 15 years in prison for Alexander, Lauren walked to Millennium Park where Richard had once proposed to her. The ring he had given her, returned months before, was now a thing of the past, as were her illusions about wealth and social status. Back in New York, the ceremony at Reynolds Technologies had reached its crucial moment. Richard took to the stage, adjusting the microphone with the same calm Charlotte had learned to admire. "When I discovered the truth about my origins," he began, "I thought I would have to choose between two identities, two families, two lives. What I learned is that the heart has an infinite capacity to expand, to embrace more love, more connections, more truths." His eyes met Charlotte's in the front row, and for a moment it was as if they were alone in the crowded hall. "Some people come into our lives just when we need them," he continued, "not to show us the way, but to walk beside us as we discover our own direction." Catherine squeezed Margaret's hand, silent tears streaming down both their faces. James Morrison slipped his arm around William Reynolds' shoulders, the simple gesture symbolizing the unlikely union of two families. After the ceremony, as the guests circulated around the ballroom, Richard pulled Charlotte out onto the hotel terrace. The city sparkled under the night sky, thousands of lights dancing against the darkness. "I've got something to show you," he said, guiding her to the parapet. From there, you could see the Reynolds Technologies building, where a new sign was being installed: Reynolds Morrison Global Enterprises. "It's official, then," Charlotte smiled, snuggling into his arms. "Yes," Richard replied, kissing her temple softly. "But it's not the only thing I want to make official." The ring he took out of his pocket wasn't ostentatious like the one he had given Lauren. It was elegant and unique like the woman it was being given to. The center stone was a sapphire surrounded by small diamonds that resembled stars. "Charlotte Madison." He began, his heart beating in rhythm with hers. "You helped me find my truth, my family, my place in the world. Now, I want to know if you would help me build our own future together." The city lights witnessed the moment, when past and future met in a kiss as two families watched discreetly from the terrace door, their hearts united in celebration of a love that was born of truth and blossomed through redemption. The reflection of the autumn sun danced through the stained glass windows of St. Patrick's Church in Manhattan, creating a kaleidoscope of colors that illuminated the central aisle. Charlotte adjusted her wedding dress in the side room, while Catherine, Reynolds, and Margaret Morrison collaborated on small details of the arrangement. "Something new," said Catherine, attaching a delicate sapphire brooch to the bouquet. "Something borrowed," added Margaret, adjusting the pearl necklace she had worn at her own wedding. Charlotte watched the two women through the mirror, amazed at how fate had intertwined all those lives in such an extraordinary way. A year ago, she was just a dedicated social worker helping Richard discover his origins. Now she was about to become an official part of a family that had learned that love transcends blood ties. On the other side of the church, Richard was adjusting, his tie for the 10th time under the amused gaze of James Morrison and William Reynolds. "Son," James began, putting a hand on his shoulder. "Relax. She's already said yes." William laughed, sharing a complicit look with his fellow father. "And, considering she helped you uncover $1 billion fortune and still fell in love with the man, not the money, I'd say you're in good hands." Reynolds Morrison Global Enterprises had become a giant in recent months, combining the Reynolds technological innovation with the Morrisons' legal expertise. But for Richard, the real success lay in the way the two families had come together, creating something bigger than any corporate empire. A movement at the side door caught his eye. Lauren had arrived, discreetly accepting the invitation that Richard and Charlotte had sent after much thought. She had chosen a seat on the last benches, her face showing a serenity that came from acceptance and personal growth. The last few months had been transformative for Lauren. After Alexander's trial, she had redirected her life using her experience to help others recognize fraudulent schemes. Her testimony in court had inspired several victims to come forward. The music began to play, and all the guests stood up. Charlotte appeared at the entrance to the church radiant in her Venetian lace dress. Her father, a retired literature professor from Boston, led her down the aisle with tears in his eyes. Richard felt his heart race at the sight of her. Charlotte was not only beautiful, she carried with her a quiet strength that had anchored him during the most turbulent times of his life. Every step she took towards him seemed to tell their story. From their first professional meetings to the nights spent researching documents, from the surprising discoveries to the quiet moments of mutual understanding. The priest began the ceremony with words about truth and love themes that had defined the couple's journey. In the front rows, the two mothers held each other's hands, their husbands equally moved. "True love," said the priest, "is not just about finding the right person, but about being the right person. About choosing the truth even when it's hard, about growing together and supporting each other through the storms of life." Richard and Charlotte exchanged vows that spoke not only of love, but of partnership, honesty, and acceptance. Each word echoed with the authenticity that had marked their relationship from the start. When the rings were exchanged, simple white gold bands with tiny sapphires inlaid, the moment symbolized much more than a marriage union. It was the celebration of a journey of self-discovery, of two families becoming one of a love born out of the search for truth. The reception was held in the New York Botanical Garden, where fall flowers created a natural and elegant setting. Lauren approached the couple during the cocktail, her smile genuine even if a little hesitant. "You deserve all the happiness in the world," she said, hugging Charlotte first and then Richard. "Thank you for showing me that it's always possible to start again." The evening progressed with dancing, laughter, and shared stories. William Reynolds and James Morrison surprised everyone with an impromptu duet of "What a Wonderful World," their voices out of tune but full of joy. Catherine and Margaret had prepared a photo album that merged moments from both families, including that first picture of baby Richard that had started the whole journey. Around midnight, Richard and Charlotte escaped for a moment of privacy in the gardens. The full moon bathed the flowers in silver light, creating an almost magical setting. "You know what's funny," Charlotte said, snuggling into her no-husband's arms. "When we started that investigation, I thought we were just looking for your origins. I didn't realize we were finding our future." Richard kissed her forehead softly. "You helped me discover that family isn't just about blood or documents. It's about choices, about unconditional love, about being there for each other in good times and bad." In the hall, the families continued to celebrate two different lineages, now united not just by legal ties but by something much deeper. Lauren watched the scene with a serene smile, finally at peace with her choices and her place in the world. The couple returned for their first dance, and as they twirled to the sound of "At Last," each person present could feel the magic of the moment, a reminder that sometimes we need to lose our way to find our true direction, and that the strongest love is that built on foundations of truth, understanding, and acceptance. The evening ended as it had begun, with family, with love, with truth. And as Richard and Charlotte left for their honeymoon, they left behind not only two united families, but a legacy that the true value of life is not in fortunes or names, but in the bonds we choose to create and the truths we choose to honor.